We have a special guest speaker, and Sierra, you can come on up here. Sierra Smith is coming to us all the way from up north in Canton, New York, and she is the director and CEO of Viable Options, which is an organization that works to come around men and women who are facing unexpected pregnancies. And she's a friend of my daughter, Grace. Grace, wave to your friend Sierra. Anyway, you didn't have to do that. I don't know why I did that. But anyway, we're blessed to have Sierra here today and just share with us just a really gospel-centered worldview on how to help individuals in such a really important time. So thanks for being here, Sierra.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me this morning. This has been, said to a couple of you, this has been on my calendar for like several months now, and I've been really looking forward to it, and it's just a joy to be here with you. So thank you, Eric and congregation, for just opening up your hearts and welcoming me this morning. I've got to acknowledge Grace. She about a year ago, I think, through her aunt and uncle, who are very dear friends of mine, got connected to me and came in for a tour of the organization and just dove in headfirst so fast. And I've told her a million times, I can't buy excitement like this. If I could, I would. But it's been just such a pleasure just to see her just dive in and get so passionate about our mission, and then become just an active advocate for that mission on her college campus. It's been a real blessing to me, and it's really because of her passion about our mission that I'm here with you this morning. So I really appreciate that. It's exciting to see the generation we exist to serve wanting to play a role in this conversation. It's such an encouragement to me. So thank you so much. My name is Sierra, as Pastor Eric told you, and I come from originally the Capital Region and transferred up to the North Country actually as a music major. I was planning to further my education in music, got plugged into a local church that I just fell in love with so fast. And around that time, I also started volunteering at Viable Options, which was so out of the realm of what I had planned, but just really caught the vision and just realized I need to spend as much time as possible investing in this. Had no long-term plans to stay involved, but the rest is history. I've been on staff since 2016, and I took over as director about 2 years ago, and it has been really a privilege. And the thing that most compelled me in the beginning was that this was really a big vision. It wasn't just a social service agency that existed to offer a few practical resources and services. We really existed to change a conversation. And that, to me, was so refreshing because the conversation has been the same for so long. And what I found here was that there was a vocabulary and a framework that empowered me to, without compromising on conviction, engage in this space in a way that really reflected the love and compassion of Christ. And we are engaged really in transforming our community and equipping individuals not just to refer to us, not just to outsource their responsibility in this space to us, but to actually become active supports for those in their own spheres who are walking through an unintended pregnancy. So what I'm sharing with you today may be somewhat different than what you expected, but I really pray that it blesses and encourages you and inspires you to play a role in this conversation and to be a representative of Christ in the lives of women in your community. So today I want to take some time to dive into the world of unintended pregnancy and really fill in the background for us of what this experience looks like and the needs that arise with it, to examine the best approach of the church to individuals facing a pregnancy decision through a gospel lens. I'm going to do my best to look at my notes because otherwise I'll be talking for a long time. So forgive me for that. But as we do so, I think it is important to take stock of the really historic cultural moment in which we are now living. As most of you know, in May of last year, a 50-year debate really came to a head when the U.S. Supreme Court announced its ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson, the outcome of which was an overturning of two previous rulings, the most notable of which being Roe v. Wade. And the result is that each individual state within the U.S. now has the ability to determine the legality of abortion for its citizens without the necessity of adhering to a federal precedent. Now, the response to this decision was predictable, varied, but very passionate. The pro-choice community was outraged and devastated by the ruling, decrying it as an egregious injustice to and oppression of women. The pro-life community was passionate in their celebration of this decision, most hailing it as the greatest victory for the sanctity of life in our nation's history. There was turbulence, noise, emotion, polarization, vitriol. It was truly a remarkable moment in our culture's history. But in the midst of it all, women and men were and are still facing unintended pregnancies, still grappling with the complexity and weight of a life-altering decision for which they're often not prepared and which frequently compounds the brokenness and need that already exists in their lives. And so the American church has begun to ask the question, what next? Where do we go from here? What is our best response? And this is the question that I hope to help provide an answer for today, because this is a cultural moment in which there really is tremendous opportunity for gospel transformation and for the people of God to become the hands and feet of Christ in a powerful way within their communities. By and large, the posture of the American church as it pertains to conversations surrounding unintended pregnancy and abortion has largely been to make the proclamation of a moral message its top and oftentimes sole priority. Now, why is this? Because there's a very real moral issue at stake here. There's a pressing conversation to be had and imperative truth to be declared that all human life is sacred, created in the image of God, and therefore imbued by him with infinite inherent worth. And at no point should the church be silent on issues of morality or injustice. Rather, we, the people of God, have a responsibility to engage on these issues, to be a mouthpiece for the Holy Spirit in its conviction of the world regarding righteousness, sin, and judgment. And at no point today or ever will you hear me say that the church should compromise on truth in order to make itself more accessible or to avoid conflict. But where I'd like to turn our focus today is to a more complete conversation and the posture of the church towards those who are broken and in desperate need of the compassionate love of Christ. Across the U.S. each year, 45% of all pregnancies are unintended. In New York State, 55% of all pregnancies are unintended, which means that thousands of women in our state and hundreds within our individual communities are facing unintended pregnancies each year. And I like to kind of paint a picture of the research that we've done and the exploration we've done in this field to give us an idea of who this woman is that's facing an unintended pregnancy and possibly considering abortion as her only or best option. Statistically, she's single, in her early 20s, and living on an income that is at least 200% below the federal poverty level. She's most likely a member of Generation Z, a generation that is currently experiencing historic and epidemic levels of intense anxiety, depression, isolation, fear of the future, and often suicidal thoughts. Some of the most common needs and experiences that she's likely processing are familial estrangement, single parenting, financial instability or debt, lack of housing or transportation, and in some cases, trauma, abuse, addiction, and even homelessness. So when she discovers an unintended pregnancy, she isn't faced with a simple question of either or. She's grappling with a set of pressures, anxieties, uncertainties, fears, and significant physical and material needs that will only be exponentially magnified by the weight of a life-altering pregnancy decision. More often than not, the experience described by these women is one of numb disbelief, overwhelming and conflicting emotions, a sense of decision paralysis, not even knowing how to begin to think about what to do, and a visceral need to regain control by any means possible. Most will confide in only one or two people, most frequently their partner and a close friend or family member. But the majority will then still carry the weight of the decision in a state of near isolation from those around them due to the vulnerable nature of the pregnancy, fear of being judged or pressured, or sadly, all too often, an unwillingness of those closest to them to really get involved and help her process the complexity of what she's walking through. Now, is this every woman's experience? Of course not. But what I've just described is representative of what many, many women throughout the nation are experiencing as they grapple with the weight of a pregnancy decision. Before we draw conclusions about what our response ought to be, we have to ask the question, how did Jesus respond to those who were broken and in need? Because as the body of Christ, it is incumbent upon us to live as an accurate reflection of his character and intention towards those around us. And when we look at Scripture, we see over and over again the ministry of Jesus was continually marked by grace and kindness, gentleness, compassion. The religious community was perpetually scandalized by the company that he kept. He not only engaged with those who were on the fringes of society and embroiled in flagrant sin, but he ate with them, he fellowshiped with them, he associated with them, he expressed value in his pursuit of them. A compelling example of this compassionate pursuit can be found in John chapter 8, starting in verse 1. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to him to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." This is one of my favorite passages in Scripture, and one that I continually come back to because I think here is such a picture, a vivid and beautiful picture of the posture of Jesus towards those who are broken. The religious leaders bring this woman into the temple. They expose her sin to the congregation. They set her before a crowd of those who are likely her friends and neighbors. And they say to Jesus with malice in their hearts, "The law of Moses tells us that we should stone this woman. What do you say?" Now, from a moral standpoint, they're correct. The Mosaic law did command that those caught in adultery be put to death by stoning. Now, this ought to have included the man who was caught in adultery with her, so we can see that their application of this moral truth was inconsistent, but the prescribed action was indisputable according to the Mosaic law. However, we see as the story progresses and as the gospel story unfolds that even though they were correct in their moral conclusion, they were missing the heart of God. In response, Jesus stoops down and writes with his finger on the ground. That's so not my first response to conflict. He's calm, he's measured, he's quiet, he's not flustered, he's not angry, he's not combative, not defensive. He's in complete control of the moment. They continue to press him. "What do you say? Should we stone her or not?" Probably growing in urgency and volume and passion by the moment, seeking to put pressure on him to respond. And all the while, this woman is standing there in their midst, exposed to the scrutiny of all around her and waiting to be put to death. Certain she's going to be put to death. And as Jesus stands and faces them, he turns the question on its head. "Let he who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." Does he throw out morality? No, he doesn't. Does he dispute the Mosaic law? Absolutely not. Rather, he cuts to the heart of the matter and reveals to those gathered the corruption of their own hearts and the desperate state of the human condition apart from the grace of Christ. He stoops down again and writes on the ground, and slowly the crowd dissipates. The temple empties as those who had only moments before been standing over this woman in moral outrage and judgment are humbled to the point where all they can think to do is to simply walk away. And they leave her alone with Jesus. Then Jesus, the only one in the crowd who was without sin and who could have at any point justly chosen to cast a stone at her and set in motion her demise, instead turns to her and says, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" She says, "No one, Lord." And he says to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Now go, and from now on, sin no more." He doesn't equivocate. He doesn't ignore her sin. Rather, he extends mercy and grace. And not only does he meet the most desperate need of her heart to be made right with a holy God, but he also meets an urgent physical need. A moment before, her very life had been hanging in the balance. Had Jesus not been there, or had he not responded in the manner that he had, she would have been put to death publicly for her sin. Instead, not only is her life saved, but she receives the gift of grace and divine enablement to pursue a life of righteousness and fellowship with God. Now, why was this possible? We know that by his own admission, Jesus did not come to negate the law, but to fulfill it. God is just. He's unchanging. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is a just penalty for our sin that must be paid, and in his holiness, he does not and cannot ignore it. But we know also how the story ends. Just weeks ago, we celebrated Advent, the miraculous incarnation through which the Holy Son of God took on flesh and dwelt among us. And this reality, God with us, Jesus in flesh, culminating in his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, is the ultimate picture of the compassionate pursuit of God. Not only did he see and acknowledge our brokenness and need, not only did he provide a solution, but he stepped into our brokenness. He put it on. He made himself vulnerable to the consequences of our sin, the devastating consequences of our sin. The God of the universe wrapped himself in weakness, in frailty, in mortality, not merely to make a way for us to be made right with him, but also so that he could become our compassionate high priest who is not unable to sympathize with us in our weakness, but who in every way was tempted just as we are, yet without sin, and who now is actively advocating on our behalf before the throne of God. Jesus looked at the desperate need of humanity, and he chose to meet us in it in the most costly way imaginable. As Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Now, where are we going with this? My question for the church today is this: does our engagement in the conversation of abortion reflect the heart of Christ as it is displayed in his pursuit of humanity? Do our social media posts, the signs we hold up on street corners, and conversations we have at our schools and in our workplaces express accurately the compassion with which Jesus pursued us? Now, whatever your response to this question personally, the data suggests that the American church as a whole has some work to do. According to a recent Lifeway study that polled women who have had an abortion, 2/3, or 65%, say church members judge single women who are pregnant. 64% believe church members are more likely to gossip about a woman considering abortion than to help her understand her options. 54% would not recommend that a friend or family member discuss an unintended pregnancy at church. A majority, 54%, think churches oversimplify decisions about pregnancy options. 52% of churchgoers who have had an abortion say that no one at their church knows about it. Fewer than half, 41%, believe churches are prepared to help with decisions about unintended pregnancies. 43% were actively attending church when they ended a pregnancy, and only 7% approached church members for help before choosing to obtain an abortion, citing fear of judgment and a lack of visible support. Now, those responses, whether or not representative of the actual posture of the church, display a perception of the people of God in America that is out of sync with the gospel message. These women, who we know from our earlier poll, are likely young, lonely, anxious, and isolated from their community with significant material needs. They don't feel that the church is a safe place for them to go when facing an unintended pregnancy and feeling that abortion is their only option. And as we've engaged in this conversation and listened to the stories of women and men who have walked through a pregnancy decision, what we've seen again and again and again is that it's the needs, pressures, barriers, and obstacles in their lives that most frequently cause them to feel powerless and without hope as they consider what to do. And yet those who ought to be best equipped to serve and care for them are those whom many of them are least likely to consider confiding in. Now, I think it's fair to say that the American church is really, in actuality, filled with compassionate people who are ready and eager to come alongside those in need. But what message does the most visible and vocal engagement of the American church in this space send to our communities, to our nation, to these individuals who are walking through these decisions? The church has largely taken a combative posture in this conversation because it feels the stakes are so high, and they are. I'm not here to diminish the reality or to discourage the people of God from proclaiming truth. The church should not be silent on issues of injustice or immorality. But like Jesus demonstrated to the Pharisees, a moral message without the mercy of Christ is an incomplete picture of the heart of God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul challenges the church in Corinth with this exhortation: "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things." Now, if the people of God have engaged on this issue, if they've spoken up about injustice, if they've fought the good fight, if they've been bold in their proclamation of truth, but without the love of Christ for a broken people, the church has missed it. And a loving response is more than a kind word or an encouraging platitude. It's even more than preaching the gospel through our words. In James chapter 2, the writer, beginning in verse 14, says this: "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to him, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving him the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And in the same way, if we see a woman or her partner, her family, staggering beneath the weight and pressure of seemingly insurmountable needs and barriers in their lives, and we do nothing to ease that burden or to mitigate the needs in their lives that are causing them to feel powerless, alone, and without hope, then we've missed it. Compassion must lead to tangible action. Jesus didn't simply forgive the sin of the woman caught in adultery and leave her to face the wrath of her community. He intervened, he provided hope, he rescued her. He didn't leave us in our broken state with no way to reach him. He met us in our brokenness and emptied himself on our behalf, not only so we could be made right with him, but so we could be brought into life abundant. The response of the church to those facing a pregnancy decision and feeling powerless and alone ought to be one that says, not only do I see your brokenness and need, not only am I willing to provide a solution, but I'm going to step into it with you. I'm willing to be inconvenienced in the most costly way imaginable, to come alongside you, make myself vulnerable to the consequences of your actions so that I can reach you and provide tangible solutions for your most desperate needs. This is a picture of the compassionate pursuit of Jesus. Now, you may be listening to this and thinking, well, that's Great, but what does that even look like? How often do you come across someone who's actually walking through the decision process of an unintended pregnancy? How do we even start to change the conversation and change the perception of our communities, of the church, as a safe place for women and their partners to go when they're processing an unintended pregnancy? My answer to that is short: come and see me after the service. We'll be spending some time diving into more practical discussion of how to walk this out individually in our own spheres, but there is a part for every believer to play in transforming their community and becoming the answer for those facing a pregnancy decision. And that really starts in the message that we're sending with our words. Do our words and our actions reflect the compassionate pursuit of Christ? The Church of Christ as a corporate body ought to be the first place that a woman goes, that a man goes, when they're feeling helpless and lost and without options. It needs to be the safest place for them as they're wrestling with the pressures and brokenness and impossibilities in their lives. The church needs to be on the front lines, not just of a moral conversation, but of a movement to embrace the woman, the man, the family that feels powerless and alone as they grapple with the reality of an unintended pregnancy. And today, each of us has an opportunity to be a part of that. This really is a historic moment for our culture. It's a moment in which our culture is asking the question, where do we go from here? And it's one of tremendous opportunity for the people of God to display his astounding mercy, grace, and compassion to those in need. And every one of us has an important role to play. So thank you for having me this morning. I really would love to talk to as many of you as possible about practical ways that you can engage in this space. But I'm just so honored and privileged to have been able to spend this time with you. Thank you for having me.
You know, and you probably picked up on this in what Sierra was saying, but she is going to spend some time down in the fellowship hall, and depending on how many people stay, the most convenient space for that, but really just to give us a fuller picture of what it looks like to live into this way of supporting men and women who face this situation in their lives. But I have to say that I love the image and the picture of Jesus in that moment. With that woman in that situation, because I immediately, to me, it's profoundly tethered to John chapter 1, where it talks about who Jesus is in the fullness of both grace and truth. And I think it's such a powerful moment where he puts that on display. There's the theological position of who Jesus is in John chapter 1, and then we see Jesus actually living into that. And we don't like to live in the fullness of grace and truth. Because when we live in that place of fullness of grace and truth, you will be uncomfortable. I'm going to say that again. If you really can grasp to live in a position of grace and truth in their fullness, you will have such profound dissonance because you'll be on unsteady ground. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about Sierra and my conversations with her, is she's willing to be in that space amongst people who might differ, and it's shaky ground, but it's actually most representative, I believe, of the posture of Jesus and how he lived his life. So I'm looking forward to that time after church, Sierra. Thank you.